Hello, my quilting friends, and welcome to the Machine Quilting Block Party. Last week, we learned how to piece half square sun block, and you can click right here to find last week's video. This week, we're learning how to quilt this block with a variety of cool designs. So let's get on our machine and learn more about free motion quilting. So let's get started quilting our sun first. I'm going to drop my needle down into the machine and bring it all the way up to the point that the needle starts to drop back down again. You can see it's almost starting to go back down into the machine. I pull on this top thread and it brings up a loop. If you tug on that loop, that's your bobbin thread. Just bring it up to the surface and tuck both threads underneath your foot. You want to leave those thread tails nice and long so that we can hide them properly in the middle layer of our quilt. Tie them off securely. Now the first thing that we're stitching on this block is kind of a challenge. It's a circle and you want to take it slow. That's why we marked the shape, so it's really easy to know exactly what shape we're wanting. But even still, you can see how I'm pivoting the block around, rotating it as I go, and I'm only stitching really less than an inch of that circle at a time before I stop, rotate, and reposition my hands. You might be wondering, well, should you be rotating the block all over the place like this? Won't this be different when you're quilting, a bigger quilt? And personally, I think that it's good to rotate as much as you need to. Don't worry about it, don't fret about it. Rotate anytime that you need to make it feel comfortable. That's really the key. Let's start branching out with our sun rays. I'm just going to stitch carefully. It's just a wiggly line. We do have some seam allowances here, so we gotta kind of be careful of that. I'm going to rotate the block around so I can see what I'm doing as I stitch back to that sun shape. I don't want to overshoot. I don't want to accidentally stitch into the sun circle. I just want to bounce against it. Now for these smaller sun rays, I'm not going to rotate. I'm going to leave the block in one position and just wiggle out and wiggle back. Now one thing that you might look at on your quilt, you might wonder about, is how do you get nice sharp points? It's a direction change, and if you see that your points are not pointy, they're instead kind of curved, a key is to stop with your needle in the down position, reposition your hands just slightly, just give yourself a second to think about it. That's all you're doing, is thinking about it a little bit more, and then carefully, slowly make those first few stitches, and then stop again on the next point. Again, reposition your hands, kind of get stable and secure, and make that direction change. So I'm just going to continue to bounce around this sun medallion all the way back to the beginning, and I'll meet you back here when we're ready to fill in our half square triangles with sharp stippling. I've finished up with the center sun, and now I am stitching in the ditch. Stitching in the ditch means to stitch right in the seam line between the two pieces of fabric that you've sewn together. And this is one of the reasons why I press my seam allowances open so that I can stitch right in the ditch between those two pieces of fabric. It also, pressing seams open also really reduces the bulk and it makes it much easier to free motion quilt over our blocks. Now you might be wondering if this is secure, because obviously my needle is going right down into an area, a channel, where the two pieces are sewn together. So another reason why we piece with a very narrow stitch length. I changed my stitch length to 1.5 millimeters, so the stitches are very, very tight and secure, so I'm able to stitch right over them in free motion and have no issues. Okay, so this area, the red and orange area, I'm going to fill with a design called sharp stippling, and it's a filler design. What that means is that we can stitch it without marking. We just have to memorize the rules of the design. So the rules for sharp stippling are to stitch a wiggly wobbly flame shape, just a wiggly shape, and to occasionally come to a sharp point and then wiggle back down and around, just occasionally coming to these sharp points and then wiggling off in another direction. So you might be familiar with stippling. Stippling is basically the exact same design, only stitched with all curves, no sharp points at all. Sharp stippling might actually be easier because the sharp points give you a good place to stop, think about the design, kind of check in, make sure everything's working really, really well, and to stop also and think about where you're going next. So in this case right here, I kind of want to wiggle back down this way, but I also want to fill in that little space. So how do I do that? Well, I stopped and thought about it for a minute, so I'm going to come back down just a bit, then wiggle back up into that area, and then come back down. Now you probably heard a louder noise as my foot went into that area. There's a lot of seam allowances. There were a lot of layers of fabric in that spot. That's why my foot sounded that way. It's just a little bit louder on my needle. So now I'm going to wiggle back down, kind of interlocking the sharp stippling. I like to work in rows, and this area is narrow enough that I can fill it basically with one row, working all the way around in a circle. It's going to flow really quickly. But I just have to remember the rules of the design. Just coming to these sharp points, wiggling back down again, and kind of making it a little bit free form, not too repetitive. So right now I'm kind of filling down and around that sun shape, and then now I'm going to take it back up and wiggle back up against the edge, the outer edge of this area. So now I'll zoom in so you can see a little bit closer to my needle. I'm wiggling back, coming to a sharp point, and again to make that nice sharp point, I can stop and think about it, stitch slowly in the other direction, and make a really nice seamless direction change. I can wiggle back and forth a little bit here, maybe curl around that edge, and then work my way back. Now you might be wondering if I'm using a stitch regulator because my stitches are all the same size and shape. And the answer is no, I'm not. The stitches are being created by the movement of my hands and the speed of my machine. This is kind of like riding a bicycle and learning how to balance yourself on the bike while also pedaling at the same time. It's just a ratio, a balancing act between speed and movement. And it's something that once you get the hang of it, you really can't unlearn it, but it might take a little while for you to get the hang of it. So definitely keep that in mind. If your stitches are not looking consistent, that's perfectly normal. Don't rip it out, just keep on stitching. The more you stitch, the better it will get. So I've filled in this whole area, and now I'm just going to basically turn the corner and continue filling with another row of the same design. You might notice right here, I kind of got bound up in this corner, and I'm going to use the ditches to travel stitch, and this is absolutely allowed. You can use the ditches, the inner or outer area of this space, to be able to move from one area of the design to another. Always use that. So here I'm just going to rotate the block a little bit, get my hands in position, and just take a few stitches in that ditch, so that way I can come back down and my sharp stippling will look great. Now you might be wondering about the scale of my design. Remember, I didn't mark it because I knew I could fill this freehand, and I am quilting it on a 1/4 inch scale. What that means is there's roughly, on average, 1/4 inch between my lines of quilting. The block is designed with a 1/2 inch scale sharp stippling, and that just means that there's more space between those lines. I like to quilt a little bit more densely. I get more repetitions of the design. I get to see the texture more clearly in that area. And because I'm using a really squishy batting, my wool batting, because I'm using that, I can get away with quilting my lines a little closer together. And this might be something that you want to try too. If you really want to get a lot of bang for your buck and a lot of practice, definitely stitch with your lines a little closer together. So I'm just going to continue filling in sharp stippling, curling around, filling in this entire area, and then I'm going to stitch in the ditch between this red and orange area and the cream background. I'm going to stitch in the ditch because I really like to use the ditches, kind of as an outline. So I have one design through all of this area, and I have another design out here, and I like that ditching, that straight line, to be kind of a separation between the two. That's the way I like to do it, but remember, you can always do this the way that you think is best. So I have already ditched around, and I'm just meeting up back with my original stitching, and then now I'm going to start branching out with, basically I call this kind of straight line echoes, starting with this triangular shape, and then I'm going to travel stitch and hit the other lines. You want to avoid having to break thread as much as possible. I've already shown you how to hide your thread breaks, and the reason we want to avoid that is because it's a little time consuming to sit there and tie off the threads in a knot and bury them in the quilt. So we want to avoid breaking thread as much as possible. So instead of breaking thread at this point, I'm going to travel stitch in the ditch. Just stitch very carefully and slowly. Notice just how slowly I'm stitching. And that is just good speed control. It's good control over my foot, operating the foot pedal. Now that I don't have to worry so much about staying right in the ditch, I can increase my speed. If I want to turn that corner really sharply, make sure to rotate the quilt around so that way I always have that straight line right in front of me. Now, a few tips about staying in the ditch or quilting your straight line perfectly straight. Try to keep the index finger of your right hand parallel with your needle. It doesn't have to be real close to your foot. It can just be right here. And visually, you're just kind of pushing the block straight through the machine. It's just a very gentle movement straight forward. And that is a good tip for keeping your straight lines nice and straight. So here, let's do that again. This time a little faster since I'm not right in the ditch. Just push it straight forward. Now you can stitch backwards, but as you can see, it's really hard to see that line. If you want to avoid rotating the block, you can certainly try this, but personally, I would advise you just to rotate it around so you can see what you're doing. In my mind, this is the exact reason why we're quilting a small block, so we can rotate whenever we need to, so we stay in the ditches, so we quilt those straight lines and keep them nice and straight, and we can see what we're doing. It's really nice to be able to rotate it around easily and always have it be in a good direction. So I'm just going to finish quilting all of these straight lines, just travel stitching, and then the next step, I'm going to ditch around this outer perimeter between the inside block and the border, and I'll meet you back here when we're ready to fill in this area with beautiful flames. So now I'm quilting in the outer border, and I'm filling this area with a wiggly hot path design. You just wiggle out, come to a sharp point. If you need to, stop, think about it, change that direction, wiggle back down to that ditch between the border and the block. And you want to be really careful not to overshoot that and stitch into the block. And so it's really just a bounce back and forth movement, wiggling forward and wiggling back. And this is one of those areas where if you want to, you can mark it, and you can see I've marked this entire area fully, or if you want to, you can leave it unmarked and just maybe even mark only the spacing of the flame shapes. That's what I did over here. So you can see how I've just put a little dot where the flames come to a point, both on the block side and in the border side, and that's going to guide my hand quilting this freehand. When we quilt with marks, I call that just quilting on a marked line, and when I quilt without marks, that's freehand quilting, meaning that you don't have any marks to guide you, you're doing it freely with your hands. So let me show you what this is going to look like and how it's going to work as I quilt just using the dots. So I'm just going to wiggle up, same thing I was doing before, and wiggle back. When I hit that dot, and it kind of gives you something to estimate and aim for every time you're stitching into that area. And you start to make a repetitive shape. It doesn't have to look exactly like the flames that we marked. It's just a wiggly line, so it doesn't have to look, anything particular. The point is to fill in this section with this cute, wiggly, flame-like texture. And this is going to be the area that we connect the blocks together, and I think it's going to look really good with all these flames. We're going to do the same design in the borders of all the blocks, and I think it's going to look really neat when they all come together. So that's it for block number 1. I really hope that you enjoyed learning how to quilt this half square sun block. Just in case you don't have the quilt pattern, click here to find the pattern that includes not only piecing information, but also a full-size free motion quilting guide you can use to mark your block and easily machine quilt it. Don't forget to subscribe to our videos so you don't miss out on any of the new videos coming out every single week for the Machine Quilting Block Party. My name is Leah Day, and until next time, let's go quilt.